In this module, we'll introduce ForeFlight, which is the flight planning application we'll use during training. Why are we using ForeFlight? Basically because it's a training requirement. During training, pilots must have access to current charts and publications. Pilots are also required to conduct flight planning as part of any ACS practical test. That means the pilot must determine the route of flight, time en route, fuel required, and then review weather and NOTAMs. One of the requirements under Part 142 is that we are not allowed to use a flight planning system that you won't have access to after training. So we can't just print a flight plan and give it to you. You won't have access to that. ForeFlight readily accepts all aircraft manufacturers' data, and we've published the required data here so that you can load it into ForeFlight without any difficulty. You can also look this information up on your own. It's in the flight manual, or if you prefer, we've loaded this table into Comply 365, and you can access the information there when you go to set up your ForeFlight. You'll also need access to the current version of some government publications that are maintained in ForeFlight. This includes the AIM, the Airman Certification Standards for ATP, and chart legends for government publications and en route charts. There are 4 ForeFlight skills that every pilot will need to have in order to graduate a course at FTI. The first is pretty straightforward. You have to install the app on an iPad. ForeFlight comes with a free 30-day trial, and you can download it from the App Store, and we recommend you download it shortly before you arrive for training. If you download it too soon, the free 30-day trial will expire, and you'll end up having to pay for a subscription, and most people don't want to do that. It's important to understand that ForeFlight is an iPad app. It doesn't run on other platforms, you won't be able to use it on a computer, and it's meant to be used as an electronic flight bag, which is the norm in the industry nowadays. You'll also have to load the aircraft and performance profile. We've provided the data to you already for the performance profile, and in the video that follows, I'll show you how to load an aircraft. Pilots will be required to flight plan using ForeFlight, and that means you'll have to load the route of flight for each simulator session, determine the required fuel based on start, taxi, and takeoff fuel, the fuel to the destination, fuel for an alternate if it's required, and any reserves. You'll also be required to interpret FAA weather products. This includes things like charts and imagery, METAR and TAFs, and NOTAMs. Finally, you'll need to be able to retrieve and interpret charts and approach plates during flight in the simulator. There's a lot of documentation and help available for ForeFlight. The best place to look for help is under the Support tab within the app itself. That'll take you to the ForeFlight website, and this has just got a wealth of information that'll help you get ForeFlight set up and make it easy for you to use. You'll also find a ForeFlight user's guide in the documentation, and the video that follows shows you how to access that. If that's not enough for you, if you go to YouTube, ForeFlight has their own channel, and there's about 150 videos loaded for ForeFlight. So there's just all kinds of information available for ForeFlight. Some of it is well beyond the scope of what we're doing. We're not going to worry about en route moving maps or ADS or any of those things because we just won't use them in the simulator. But the basic functionality is fairly straightforward. It's a simple iPad app to set up and use. In the next video, we'll spend about 20 minutes stepping you through setting it up, loading it, and how to find the information you'll need. And if you need further information, again, click on the Support tab and go to the ForeFlight videos, or read the ForeFlight user guide in the Documents section of the app. When you first open the ForeFlight application, it'll normally open to the map or the last page you were on. And the first thing we'll want to do is make sure that we've got current downloads for the app. Just choose the downloads from the More tab at the lower right. In this case, my iPad's up to date, so now we'll look at adding an aircraft to the profile. Go back to the More tab and scroll down and find Aircraft. And using the plus arrow, we'll click on plus, and then we'll add a new A320. And I'm just going to use A320 as my tail number. Type that in. Choose Done, and then it'll ask for a serial number, and I'll call this A320 FTI. The next thing I'll need is an aircraft type, and I'll choose the drop-down menu next to aircraft type. And if I start typing in A320, it'll give me a list of aircraft that are already in there. And I'm going to scroll down through this list, and the one I want is the A320-232. I'll select that with the round radio button, and now it loads a little bit of information about the airplane. I'll scroll down my list and there's not a whole lot of information here, but I do want to make sure that I've selected knots for the units. I don't have to worry about glide speed or ratios. I'll update my max altitude or my default cruise altitude to flight level 350, and you'll notice when I put in 350, it asked if I wanted 35,000 instead of 350. I'll make sure the fuel is in pounds and that the aircraft fuel is Jet A. I'm going to use 1,000 pounds for start, taxi, and takeoff, which is a little more than the default 880 pounds. And then I can look at the ICAO surveillance codes. We won't be filing, so that's not a big deal. And I'll just choose slant alpha for the FAA equipment. The rest of the information's optional. You don't really need it since we're not going to file. And I can make this my default aircraft, but I want to make a few more changes first. I'll scroll back up and I want to go to the performance profile. And I'm going to add a basic performance profile using some information out of the Airbus Performance Manual. And you can also find this information in your syllabus and in Comply 365. I'll start by naming this profile the A320-323. I can name it whatever I want. And I'll start by putting in a climb true airspeed of 300 knots, which I got from the Airbus manual. A climb fuel per hour of 11,000 pounds. Again, this comes right out of the Airbus manual. Rate of climb of 2,500 feet per minute. A true airspeed of 450 knots, and I calculated that off 7.8 Mach at 350. And a cruise fuel flow per hour of 5,500 pounds, again, out of the Airbus manual. The descent speed will be 300 knots true. I'll use 1,000 pounds per hour in the descent. And I'll plan on a descent rate of 2,500 pounds per minute. And all these numbers are fairly conservative. If I'm happy with that, I'll make it the default for the aircraft. So whenever I select the A320, it'll choose this as my default. I'll cruise down through the list again. And now I can choose this to make it my default aircraft if I'm going to A320 flight training, and I can create a flight plan. I'm going to create my flight plan from the Flight Plan tab, and I'll start by selecting Plus, and then I'll tap on the departure, and in this case I'll choose Kennedy. I'll choose a destination of Chicago O'Hare, and at this point I'll leave the alternate blank. I'll choose an A320 for my aircraft, and that populates some of the profile information. And then I'll choose that I want an IFR flight plan. Looking down through the list, it's going to give me a cruise altitude of 35,000 feet, which is what I want. And I can also look at the route advisor and see what's out there. And the route I want is actually in there today. So I'm going to choose that, and I'll ignore the system asking me if I want 390 because I told it I wanted 350 for a cruise altitude. The rest of the information I can leave blank. At the top right of my display, I'm going to choose the up arrow in the paper, and I'm going to share this information with the map. That updates my route of flight. It's also going to let me make some changes to this route of flight. You'll notice that I'm going to runway 9 on the Windy 2, and I don't want that. So I also need a departure. So I'll select the departures, and out of Kennedy, I'll select the Kennedy 5 with no transition, but I do need a runway, and I'm going to choose 31 right. I'll add that to the route of flight, and then I'll go back to my procedures. And for Chicago, I'm going to change my arrival. So I'll choose the arrival. I want the Windy 2 arrival, but I want a different transition. I want to come in over Flint, Michigan. So I'll choose that. And then I normally want 22 right, but it's closed. So today I'll take 22 left, and I'll add that to my route of flight. The error that shows in the little suitcase is because I didn't pack the route of flight. So I'm just going to select the suitcase, and I'll pack, and I'll explain that later. And then I can adjust the settings, the brightness, or the night day mode as I need to before I go ahead and add this to my favorites. So I selected the star at the bottom of the display, and then I'll choose a name, and I can name this anything I want. Even if I type in Kennedy wrong like I've done here, it's just a file name. So I'll save this as Kennedy to Chicago demo. And now it's available from the list at the top of the screen. When I select the favorites up there, I can scroll down, I can find this flight, tap on it, and it will load the route of flight back into my nav log, which is really helpful. I'll show you in a little bit how we can use this if we somehow delete our route of flight. Now I'm going to go ahead and choose the upload icon, and I'm going to upload this back to the flights tab because I've made some changes and I want to make my nav log more accurate. So now I've uploaded this, and you can see that in my flights tab, I get 701 miles, an hour and 53 minutes, an ETA of 1523 based on the filing time, but it also gives me the fuel that I need. I can scroll down and check my route of flight. I can look at it on the map and see the current weather radar. And then if I'm happy with this, I can take a look at my nav log. And this is my flight plan. I can print this or I can use it off my iPad, but this is what I can use to load my FMC once I get into the airplane. It has all the waypoints, the distances, and the courses, and the basic information that I need. Again, I can come back to that route, and if I want to add an alternate, I can add Rockford. It's not required for weather, but KRFD, I'll add it just to show you how it's done. I go ahead and choose Add Rockford, and you can see that in the Alternates tab, it now shows up, and I can pull up the info for Rockford if I like. I've got my performance profile the way I want it. It looks like this is just about ready to go, and now we can take a look at the Briefing tab next. Flight briefings are going to be important because they have a lot of information, and the ATP students will focus heavily on the flight briefing. We'll retrieve the flight briefing, and we can see that ForeFlight will give us any temporary flight restrictions. It'll tell us if there's a closed airport, what time Chicago is closed, what time Rockford's closed. And then when you're done reviewing this, you can look down at the bottom and you can see convective sigmets. I'll go ahead and choose those. It tells me if the convective sigmet is active during my passing time or if it's not active, and I can scroll through that. And from the weather radar picture earlier, that kind of makes sense. I saw there was a lot of convective activity today in the Chicago area. Next, I can look at icing airmets, and I can see that there's some icing out there. Some of it's active, some of it's not. And then I can move on and I can look at the synopsis. I can also take a look at the METARs, and that'll be something the check airman will definitely ask you to read during your oral examination. So you can see that the Kennedy METAR shows up at the top along with all the waypoints along your route of flight. You'll notice the green and red and blue dots tell you what the weather is along your route of flight. And then at the end, you'll find your destination and the alternate weather. Make sure you know how to read a METAR as part of your oral. I can look through the list of PIREPs, and I really don't care about a PIREP from a Piper Seminole at 2,000 feet, but looking at a 737-800, I might want to tap on that PIREP, and you can see I get a little eye icon on the map, and that tells me where that aircraft was. So as part of my flight planning process, it's nice to know what's out there. You wouldn't be surprised today that most of the PIREPs are due to turbulence because of the convective activity that's out there. I can take a look at the TAFs, I can look at the winds aloft. And again, TAFs are going to be something you're expected to read during the oral, so make sure you know how to read a terminal area forecast in the undecoded format. You can go ahead and pull them up, you can read them in ForeFlight, and you can practice. There's plenty of them in here, and it follows the same format we looked at before with the departure, all the waypoints on the route of flight, and the destination. I can take a look at my winds aloft from an overview, or I can get a plan form view looking at the winds aloft, or I can get them in a table format. Next, I can look at the NOTAMs, and I can find all the NOTAMs for Chicago and also for Kennedy, and they're listed in the order of the flight. So they're going to start with Kennedy, and they break the NOTAMs down to what's on the airfield, what's en route, etc. You'll be asked to read NOTAMs as part of the oral examination. It's not particularly difficult, but spend some time in here, make sure you're familiar with the format. I can look at en route NOTAMs. And I can also take a look at my alternate. When I'm done, I can close that out. I can update my map to make sure it has the same information that's in my flight plan. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pack this one more time. What packing does is it downloads all the weather, all the NOTAMs, and everything you need so you can get a nice little binder that has all the required approach plates that you're going to want. So let's take a look at the approach plates in the binders. If I choose the Plates tab at the bottom of the application, it'll open up and it gives me the opportunity to add a flight binder. And here's my flight from KJFK to Chicago. So I'll choose that. And now it has the departure airport of Kennedy. It's got the NOTAMs on there that are specific to my departure and specific to Kennedy. I can choose the Kennedy departure just by tapping the departure tab. There's no approach at Kennedy, but there is an arrival into Chicago. And again, I can look at the NOTAMs there. I can choose the approaches into Chicago. And now it doesn't know which approach I want because I only gave it the runway. So I'll select the ILS 22 left, and then I'll scroll down and I'll find the RNAV approach to 22 left. I want to have that available just as a backup. You never know in the simulator when the ILS may be out of service. I got those approaches selected. Again, I can look at the NOTAMs for those approaches, and then I can go to the field diagram under airport. So all that information is in my binder. The miscellaneous tab has some land and hold short information, just in case I might need that. And then I can cycle back to an individual approach plate. Here's Kennedy, and under the settings, I can go ahead and make it a day view versus a night view, and I can look for recent approaches and see if there's something on there that maybe I want. So the binder is a fairly handy tool to use once you've created a flight, and you should be creating one for each of your segments. I can choose the edit function, which is the pen at the top, and I can choose different colors, so I can circle things like min safe altitude or the minimums in the format that I want. I've got this pretty well marked up. I'm going to go back to the map. Now I've got my nav log on the map as well. I can scroll through that. If I tap on FPL at the top, I can get rid of that. And it wanted me to pack some fuel prices on there. That can maybe be a little bit of an annoyance, but we'll pack it and get rid of the icon. After this, we'll probably ignore anything that's on there. Like other Apple apps, the gear is your settings, and I can play with the brightness under settings, and I can also invert the chart colors, which can be really handy in the simulator. The darker chart colors are less bright, they don't bother you as much. You can pinch and zoom on the map to zoom in, and it takes just a second to focus, and then you can slew around. So you can look at this map anywhere you want. You can find waypoints. If I want to type in the Flint VOR, I type in FNT, and it starts with the airport, but if I scroll down, I'll eventually find the Flint VOR. And when I tap on the VOR, it's going to take me right to it. It also allows me to add it to my route of flight or remove it from my route of flight, gives me the lat long, the mag var, and if I tap on the more information, I can even pull up the weather. I can set altitude and speed restrictions there. So that would be used for flight planning if I wanted to cross the VOR at a certain speed or altitude, and you can use that to drive a higher overall fuel or a more realistic overall fuel. And again, I can pull up the weather at Flint if I want that. I can also type in an airway. In this case, I'm going to type in Jet 95. And when I do, it offers me Jet 95. Unfortunately, it can make it part of my route of flight, and I don't always want that to happen. So in this case, I choose Deer Park to the CFB VOR, and now I've altered my route of flight. And that may not be something I really intended to do. But if I made my route of flight a favorite, I tap on the favorite star at the top, scroll to the bottom. There's my demo flight I just selected, and it automatically loads my route of flight. And of course, there's the packing icon again. It probably has fuel or something else that when I changed my route of flight back isn't there. Let's look at some of the other tabs, starting with the airport tab. And I can have favorite airports selected up at the top. I can also select recent airports or airports associated with maps in my route of flight, or I could just browse through a list of airports. And those are all available in the black menu up at the top. Back on the favorites, I've got Kennedy selected, and I can see the information for JFK. I can also tap on the airport display, which gets me a taxi diagram. I can go back to airports at the bottom left, and now I can choose on comments, and I can read any information that people found important about Kennedy. I can also read some additional remarks. I can look through the frequencies for approach, departure, flight service, anything I might need to find at Kennedy. I can find weather information. METAR and TAFs are also available from the airports tab as well as in the planning, and I can read the information, and it's decoded here as well. I can look at the runways. I can see the runway length. I can find the glide slope indications for those runways, the slope associated with them, if there's any displaced threshold, heading information, additional lighting information or edge information, edge lighting information, and the elevation of the runway. I can also find all the procedures associated with the runway. So I can select a procedure directly from the airports tab by going to the runway, or I can go to the procedures tab and I can get it there as well. And this information will be available for every runway on the airport as well as the status of the runway. From the airport tab, I can see there's a ForeFlight diagram, which is kind of a dumbed down diagram. They take all the communications off. It's a little less cluttered, or I can use the standard FAA airport diagram. If I want to rotate this diagram, I can choose the rotate icon up at the top in the banner, and then I can zoom in. And you can see in this case, I've highlighted what I think my route of taxi is going to be from the ramp out to the runway. I can choose departures, and I get all the departures available at that airport. In this case, I'm going to choose the Kennedy 5, and you can see the NOTAMs for the Kennedy 5 are available to me. I can go back to plates, or I can just hit close, and I can look at arrivals. Again, I get a list of arrivals, and it tells me which are for jets, which are for turboprops. So obviously, we're not going to get the Pauling 2. We'll take a look at the Parch 3, and I can zoom in on that. I'll close that out, and I can get a list of approaches as well. And I can scroll through as many of these approaches as I want. When I've selected my procedures, I'll choose NOTAMs, and you'll see the NOTAMs are listed chronologically. I've got the future, today, 7 days old, 30 days old, etc. The NOTAMs that apply at the airport, you'll be responsible for understanding what they mean. What actually applies in the sim will be up to the discretion of the instructor. We're not necessarily going to apply real world NOTAMs to the simulator situation. So just know how to read a NOTAM, but don't assume that all these are going to apply. On some approach plates, you'll see down at the bottom that there's more than one page available. Here we see page 1 of 2. And if I swipe over to the right, I'll see the second page, and that has the text for this particular departure. After I'm happy with my approach plates, I want to look at the documents. And there's actually a pretty good library in here. I can create my own binders, or I can open up individual documents. I've opened up the user's guide to ForeFlight Mobile, and you'll probably want to read through that. And you can see that just like most Apple products, I can select a bookmark. I can actually add it to a specific binder. And if I choose on the search icon, I can type in a term and search for that, or I can just go to the contents or any bookmarks I've made. So I can find my way around these things pretty well. I can print this, or I can email it to myself if I want it on another device. And then I can go back through and I can look through the list of documents, and there's several things I can have here. Some of the documents that are worth downloading include the IFR High Legends charts, so you can refamiliarize yourself with the government publications if you haven't looked at that in a while. It's only one panel thick. You also may want to download the AIM and make sure you have a current version of that. You can select the ForeFlight tab down on the lower left, and that'll give you a list of ForeFlight manuals. You can also select the FAA tab, and there's quite a few documents here in here that may be interesting to you. One of the ones you may want to dig into is the Federal Air Regulations, and the part that is probably most interesting is Part 61, and that has all the requirements for pilot certification. If you have any questions, this is where you'll find the answers to those. It's important that you download and read the Airman Certification Standards for Airline Transport Pilots. That's got a lot of valuable information. And then you'll also find there's several handbooks that have pretty much any of the reference information you may need as you prepare for your type rating or for an ATP course. There's a wealth of information here. Let's move on after this and take a look at some of the imagery that's available to us. All pilots should be familiar with government products for weather forecasting, but in particular, pilots seeking their initial ATP should be familiar with some of the information here, like prog charts, convective forecasts, and how to read them. Winds aloft, air mets, SIGMETs in particular. If you look at today's SIGMET, it's not surprising given the amount of convective activity that there are a bunch of SIGMETs out there, and you should understand how to identify where those are. Icing severity, again, in the vicinity of thunderstorms, there's going to be icing out there, and you should be able to identify where you're likely to encounter icing, what altitudes will put you above it, what altitudes will put you below it. Another area of concern for airline pilots is forecasting turbulence, and we want to be able to forecast areas of turbulence using ForeFlight and also areas of significant weather by reading radar returns. We've already looked at the flights tab. We've got a scratchpad tab where you can put pretty pictures and notes. We can also add checklists if necessary. We've talked about the aircraft, and the final area to look at is going to be the support that's available. There's quite a bit of support available for this app, and if you're unfamiliar with it, start by watching the videos. Go to the support tab under more and look at the recommended playlists. You probably want to start with just getting started. There's quite a bit of information here. And as we talked about earlier, there's also a ton of information available in the pilot's guide. So you can open the pilot's guide, you can read through that. Remember, we can search this for particular terms, or we can just go to the table of contents and look things up. And finally, don't forget that there's a lot of information available to you via YouTube. There's more than 140 videos available. The ForeFlight app is getting upgraded all the time. So this video is just a brief introduction to it. And over time, some of the icons may change just a little bit. And your best resource will always be to circle back to their website where you'll have the latest and greatest information on how you can use ForeFlight and how other people are using it too. So one of the questions we get quite frequently is, are there other options available for charting? And the answer is yes. There's an option available for Jeppesen charts within the ForeFlight app, although that does come at additional expense. It's not part of the free trial. But if you have a strong preference for Jeppesen charts, you can use those within the app. You can also use the Jeppesen app if you have a subscription on your own for something like Jep Mobile Flight Deck. Those are suitable alternatives to ForeFlight for charting, as would be Lido, or if you want to go get the government charts on your own and download them. There is no viable alternative for the flight planning portion of this, though. Flight planning is a required part of the oral examination, and you simply have to do it. The FCOM data is available, and you could theoretically add up all the mileage for your route of flight, but that's unwieldy and time consuming, and it's not going to fit within the oral exam. So for the flight planning portion, you're simply going to have to use ForeFlight. So please make sure you download the app, familiar with it by the time you get to the check ride. The application gets updated frequently, and there's more training and videos available from ForeFlight via their website and on YouTube. And of course, the FTI instructors will help you if you're having difficulty during training. They're more than happy to help show you how to utilize the app going forward.
In this module we've covered installing the app on an iPad, loading aircraft and performance profiles, creating a flight plan and retrieving and interpreting charts and approach plates. To receive credit for this module, click on the Exit and Close button at right. If you desire to re-enroll in this module, you can do that by selecting this module on the Re-enrollment form in the Mint Forms tab.